until 1721. So you have the Ice Age, everything's depopulated, Neanderthals are roving around, you have the Para-Proto-Tibetans, hunting woolly rhinoceroses and bison and, all the other stuff that was roaming around the great steppe that ranged from, the Netherlands and the Rhine all the way to Manchuria in modern-day northeastern China back in the Ice Age. There's all sorts of population replacements, Ice Age tribes dying off right and left. But the geography of Ukraine has just been flat for a very, very long time. The country is bisected by the Dnieper River, which is kind of the main waterway for the country. To the east, you have the Don and the Nemets, which flows through it. To the west, you have the Bug River, and you also have the Vistula River, whose tributaries originate in western Ukraine. So you have kind of three main river basins that people would transport themselves on, and of course this is extremely important to later Ukrainian history. Ice Age ends, things start thawing out, Indo-Europeans roll in. One branch of the Indo-Europeans ends up kind of to the northwest in the Baltic and in Belarus. They hang out in the swamps and the forests. They are the ancestors of the Baltic peoples, which are the Latvians, Lithuanians, as well as the Slavic peoples, the Belarusians, the Serbs, the Russians, the Ukrainians, the Poles, the Bulgarians, all those guys. Because Ukraine is so flat, only the northern, more forested and swampy parts are able to be ruled by the Slavic people after they split from the Baltic people in 1000 BC. And for the next 1500 years or so, or I guess 1200 years at a minimum, you have these Iranian-speaking steppe nomads who are kind of rampaging around on the steppe and keeping the Slavs out of, controlling the bulk of Ukraine. The steppe peoples, they had a very different lifestyle. They were pastoral, so they herded cattle, kind of grazed, basically cowboys, like what we had in the American West. They grazed their cattle, they would ride their horses, and they could mobilize a huge fraction of their population in military campaigns because they were nomadic. So as a result, they could build up very considerable armies, even though population-wise they could be massively outnumbered by the Slavic farmers. So you have Mongol people, the Avars roll in, they conquer a good chunk of Eastern Europe, the Slavs pour in after them, and they end up settling in the Balkans with that wave. Some of them move into Poland, Eastern Germany. And so it's the East Slavs, though, that kind of stay home in the Slav Urheimat, the original homeland, which is in kind of northern Ukraine and Belarus. And they eventually get, they take over parts of Ukraine. And there's other Turkic peoples related to the Chuvash, who take over, and, they're just kind of dominating the steppe. Eventually, you have, the Slavs, they learn all these new agricultural techniques, they have a population explosion, they start to expand to the north and the east as well as the south, and you have these kind of large Slavic tribal confederations that are forming. The Vikings, a group of them called the Varangians, who are of mixed Finnic and kind of Germanic Scandinavian Viking origin, go and conquer them and unite them into what's called the Rus in a series of events that's actually very poorly documented, and there's almost certainly a lot of forgeries. They go and they unite this kind of, Kievan Rus, conquer a lot of Western Russia, Ukraine. They go to war with the steppe peoples and are very successful, destroying one of them, the Khazars. And then they start to fragment. The fragmentation is heavily based around geography. You have some of them in the west that kind of live around the tributaries to the Vistula River, which flows into the Baltic Sea. They kind of have, that's the origin of the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian language, Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian identity. And then, to the northeast, you have the, more traditional, like core Russia around Moscow, Vladimir, Nizhny Novgorod, all of those cities, Tula. And they go and kind of form the basis of what becomes Muscovy and later Russia. A lot of those states are destroyed when the Mongols show up and kill most of the population. And in the end, you have these kind of, the country is so fragmented, you end up with having two Orthodox metropolitans. One of them is set up in Moscow. One of them is set up in Galicia. That's that region of Western Ukraine that goes into, the Vistula River and eventually the Baltic Sea. Meanwhile, Moscow and all those cities, their rivers all flow into the Volga River, which eventually flows into the Caspian. Rivers, huge deal. We talked about those in the other two lectures. So much easier to transport goods by sea than it was by land. So as a result, access to the rivers was very, very, very important. The other thing that was important was control of portage sites that were close to kind of two different river basins. It's very difficult to build canals, of course, with the technology that they had in the Middle Ages. So as a result, you would have to actually pick up the boat off the ground and physically drag it to the next river and then sail it down that river. So favored a lot of kind of like boats with low keels, and that were relatively lightweight, so you could carry them. So, a lot of the cities and different stuff were built based off of that geography, or just not built at all. And that's one of the reasons Kiev was built, since it's kind of the confluence of two rivers as they feed into the Dnieper River. I mean, one of the rivers is the Dnieper River itself, but it's got another tributary right by it. So very strategic location. People would kind of land their boats there when they were, kind of sailing down the river. So anyhow, you have kind of the consolidation. You have Galicia, Volhynia in the west, and you have Moscow in kind of the northeast. They're consolidating. Galicia, Volhynia eventually collapses. Their dynasty goes extinct because their ruling family is incredibly brave, like bold men. They die fighting the Mongols. You have the Hungarians that take over briefly, and then the Poles and Lithuanians eventually take over. The Poles and Lithuanians eventually end up united to fend off these German Teutonic Knights who are trying to forcibly convert everyone to Catholicism and won't stop even after everyone does convert to Catholicism. They're building artillery, menacing everyone, leveling villages, not nice people. So anyhow, Poland and Lithuania, they form a dynastic union, gradually consolidate with each other. The Slavic people, the Ruthenians, the Rus, whatever you want to call them, that were controlled by Lithuania in western Ukraine and central Ukraine and Belarus, were not very happy about this. They formed the majority of the Lithuanian population and were not happy that they were being forcibly, under Catholic rule. The Catholics, led by the Jesuits, they go and organize a campaign to integrate the Orthodox Church structure into the structure of the Catholic Church. So that's where you have the Uniate Church, which is formed at the end of the 1500s. There's all sorts of controversies. A lot of the Orthodox people bitterly resented this. They're massacring each other, whatnot, all sorts of horrible cruelties. But a lot of people in the west of Ukraine did becoming Catholics. There were some Ukrainian families that, ended up becoming Catholics and Polonized, much like the Lithuanian families were. Meanwhile, there were a lot of other people that decided to align themselves with the Russians instead, whether out of religious sympathy. In Russia by this time was based out of Moscow, which had consolidated a lot of stuff. So you have that's going on. The Russians are kind of positioning themselves as the sword and shield of orthodoxy, and they're annexing a lot of these kind of Slavic-speaking Orthodox Christian and religion territories on the border between, what's nowadays Belarus and eastern Ukraine. So it goes into the 1600s. You have kind of that ongoing religious conflict. The Russians kind of collapse for a brief period. The Poles collapse. A lot of people in what's nowadays Ukraine, they go and they align with the Cossacks. The Cossacks are kind of these freebooters. They're not egalitarian, but certainly more egalitarian than the societies of Poland, Lithuania, as well as the Russian Empire. They did have nobilities. Some of them were bought off as mercenaries by the Poles. And they kind of viewed themselves as independent. They would ally with the Crimean Tatars, who were Turkic-speaking Muslim people based out of the peninsula of Crimea. Sometimes they would ally with the Orthodox Russians based out of Muscovy, and sometimes they would align themselves with the Poles or some of the very powerful Polish noblemen who could act independently of the King of Poland. So that's kind of the 1600s. Eventually, in the middle of the 1600s, there's this terrible, terrible series of catastrophes, affects the whole world. It's part of a little ice age, mass die-offs everywhere. A third of Poland dies. A good chunk of Ukraine dies too. Russia has stuff like the Salt riots. And in the end, the Russian and Swedish states end up being more robust than the Polish state. The powerful nobility do succeed in their campaigns against the King of Poland. So they end up weakening the Polish state. The Poles don't have as much of a professional army. It's kept very small. And the Polish king is left reliant on his powerful noblemen to deal with all these issues. Among those powerful noblemen is, the various Cossack leaders of Ukraine, who he can't really control anyways, and they're always like fighting wars with the, the raiding into the Ottoman Empire, which is kind of modern day Turkey, Bulgaria, Greece, Romania, even in the Caucasus with like Armenia, Syria, Egypt, all those places. So the Cossacks raiding into the Ottoman Empire by both sea and land. They're sailing down the Dnieper River. They're going on the Black Sea, raiding the coast, causing all sorts of problems for the Turks. The Turks go and they're always fighting wars with the Poles. So all sorts of very confusing stuff. But there is, this virtually independent Ukrainian state, the Zaporizhian host, that's kind of based out of south central Ukraine. Zaporizhia literally means beyond the rapids. So the Dnieper River, that's the river that bisects Ukraine, you can sail down it for quite some distance, but once you get down to a certain point, you have this series of rapids. I think there's like 80 something of them. So you can't sail a ship over it. You'll just break, or at the time you couldn't. You can now because it's dammed. And they've like flooded. They've got this whole reservoir and everything. So got river barges and everything that work pretty well. But back then it was not. You could not sail ships down it. So as a result, the Cossacks kind of set up their main base just to the south of that. So as a result, it was very difficult for anyone to ship soldiers or supplies or anything down to them, so they could, live relatively free. And that's kind of the, so a lot of the Ukrainian people today, they do trace their identity partly back to Galicia, Volhynia, where you have that kind of organizationally and state, like an independent state in the west of Ukraine, very, very, like 1,000 years ago. But then you also have this, Zaporizhian Cossack state in the south of the Dnieper River, that's also independent, in the 16 and 1700s. They go and they fight a couple wars with the Poles, as well as the Russians, both of whom claim sovereignty. Poland's kind of devastated, so the Russians win, and the Ukrainians are devastated too. So they eventually kind of accede to, putting themselves under the Russian emperor, and that is 1668, I believe. So kind of the struggles go on. Some of the Ukrainians rebel on the Dnieper, against both the Poles and against the Russians. The Russians managed to keep them, for the most part, under control. Some of the Ukrainians go and see an opportunity to join the Swedes when the Swedes go and fight this giant war with Russia from 1700 1721. The Russians are able to intercept them, destroy their kind of base, and most of the Ukrainians end up aligning with the Russians during their war with the Swedes. So Russia wins a giant victory. They conquer quite a bit of territory in the Baltic, and the Ukrainians are kind of defeated and discredited. So that's the situation where we left off last time. Now, to the south, while all of this was going on, there was the Crimean Hanat, which is this group of Turkic-speaking people. There had been many, many Turkic-speaking peoples that had kind of ridden through that great steppe region. Again, the steppe is that very, very flat land, so that's good for grazing. Reaches all the way from Hungary in the west to Manchuria in the east. Some of the ecologies in like Poland and eastern Germany are quite good as well. I think Soviet planners in the Cold War were, that was kind of their idea. They would follow the paths of those nomads as they would, drive their tanks into Germany or whatnot and just cover the flatlands. Because there is kind of a extension, the Great European Plain, does extend a bit further west than the traditional steppe. Where was I going with this? Oh yeah, so you have these Crimean Tatar nomads, and they're not like totally nomadic at this point. They do have a lot of horsemen. They do have a lot of people who are pastoral, but they also have townspeople. They have a lot of agricultural people, and their main export though is slaves. They have salt mines and some goods, but by far their best export is slaves. So what they would do is anytime they were running out of money or they just saw an opportunity, they would raise an army of a couple, score thousand of horsemen, and they would raid into Poland, Russia, Ukraine. Sometimes I think they even made it to Germany one time. They could get pretty deep into Lithuania as well. And they would just go and kidnap all the men and women they could find, and they would, bring them back to Crimea, and there they would sell them to various merchants who would bring them to the Ottoman Empire. For the period from 1500 to 1700, there's kind of an argument for numbers. The highest numbers are about 3 million, the lowest numbers are about 1 million. Regardless, it was a fairly substantial number of people. Slave mortality, at least initially, wasn't nearly as bad as what it was for the Atlantic slave trade, since it's a much, much shorter journey to get from Crimea to Constantinople, Istanbul, Byzantium, whatever you want to call it, than sailing from West Africa to Brazil or to the southern part of the United States. So as a result, there were a lot of people of Slavic descent who became fairly influential in the Ottoman Empire. One of them being the actual wife of one of the sultans, Roxana. I always get her confused with Alexander's wife. So yeah, you've got all these slaves. Some of them actually preferred, being slaves under the Crimean Tatars or under the Ottomans than, being serfs under the Russian Empire or under the even under the Cossacks. There's one recorded instance where the Cossacks, I think in the 1670s, came across, they were raiding into Crimea. They found all of these slaves, and they offered these slaves, hey, you can come back with us and be free. And the slaves, pointed out they didn't have anywhere to go. They didn't have family connections or anything, so they were just going to stay in Crimea. So the Cossacks, of course, they didn't take that very pleasantly, consider them traitors, and just killed everyone. It's a very, rough world. So that was kind of the, Crimean Hanat that you've got in the, Crimean Peninsula. They had their society, they had Greeks, they had Goths who had actually survived, and, they had invaded the region in the 2nd century AD, and they'd just been hanging out in the mountains for hundreds and hundreds of years. And, they kind of got absorbed by the Crimeans. They actually had their own independent state in the 1400s. They had Greeks. They had 3 different types of Jews, actually. They had, kind of these possibly Khazar originating Jews. They had Karaites Jews who do not follow the Talmud. They go by the Old Testament only. And then you had kind of the traditional Ashkenazi Jews who, are much more famous and, are the overwhelming, source for kind of the Jews in America today. So very, very interesting kind of heterogeneous culture. They had other groups like the Nogais, or another Turkic tribe that migrated from Central Asia a couple hundred years later, and they were living in kind of the southern part of the Don River Basin, maybe a few score kilometers for the area surrounding the Sea of Azov and kind of the modern cities of Donetsk, Mariupol, Rostov-na-Donu, and Taganrog. So again, Crimean Hanats, very, very heterogeneous culture, very close links to the Ottoman Empire. They were Muslims. The Ottomans actually had garrisons of soldiers in the port cities, which were more controlled by the Ottoman Turks than they were by the Crimean Hanat. But that kind of changed. It was a kind of complicated relationship. Much like some of the Cossack groups and the other Tatar and Turkic groups that were under the kind of rule of the Russian Empire, they weren't considered subjects. Like a lot of, like for example, in Russia, the noblemen would go and they would bow before the Russian emperor, the Tsar, and they would refer to themselves as his slaves. The Crimeans, and there was something similar for the Ottoman Empire. For the Tatars and the other Turkic peoples, though, they would actually go and be greeted as a brother. At first as the older brother, but then later as a younger brother. And they were invited to participate in campaigns as allies rather than being ordered to take part in military campaigns as servants. So it was kind of the structure of these empires. It was a lot more heterogeneous. They weren't kind of centralized modern states like you would think of, say, the modern day United States, revolutionary France. They were very heterogeneous, had a lot of different institutions going on within them, and they had multiple competing claims to sovereignty. And it wasn't just the tribes, but you also had the Orthodox Church as well. So the Crimean Tatars, they cause all sorts of problems. They're enslaving people, they're raiding villages, and just kind of devastating these kind of steplands to the south. So the Russians, they had waged several campaigns against them. They'd actually successfully conquered the kind of Sea of Azov and the Ottoman and Crimean Tatar outposts in the region in the late 1600s. However, they were forced to give them back to the Ottomans and the Crimean Tatars after Peter the Great got captured by the Ottoman Turks, or I guess I should say surrounded. He wasn't really captured by the Ottoman Turks when he invaded the Ottoman Empire in the 1710s. So he has to give that back. Crimean Tatars keep launching raids, and a lot of that kind of steppe region, the whole south of Ukraine, remains very depopulated. Nonetheless, because the Swedes were pretty badly defeated, the region does become safer. There's a lot of runaway peasants who go and they join those Zaporizhian Cossacks we talked about, who are kind of in the south of the Dnieper River. So I think the population of the Zaporizhian Cossack host by kind of the middle of the 1700s is actually close to 500,000. So you've got a substantial population that's living free of both Polish and Russian rule, even if they were, technically under Russian rule at that point. The Cossacks in other parts of Ukraine weren't as free as the Zaporizhians. Kind of in the northeast of Ukraine, in what's nowadays Kharkiv or Kharkov Oblast, you go, and the Russians actually found Kharkov or Kharkiv. They built a fort there. It controls one of the rivers that flows into the Nemets River, which eventually flows into the Don. And so the Russian outpost there, it has some Cossack rebellions, but eventually they kind of bring the Cossacks into that region. That region was called Sloboda Ukraina, basically free Ukraine. The part of Ukraine that wasn't controlled by, roving bands of Turkic nomads. So they kind of restored order there. That area has a population boom as well. The Russian government kind of turns a blind eye to peasants running away to those regions. Since they know they need them populated and garrisoned to, fend off these roving nomads who are causing all sorts of problems. So the 1700s, that's the Russian government finally has the upper hand for a variety of reasons. It's, stable enough, organized enough. You have the spread of literacy among certain groups. There's actually, a couple thousand people, possibly, more than 10,000 who are literate. This was greatly helped by the conquest of Kiev from the Poles, in that war we talked about from the 1640s to the 1650s. So with the capture of these religious academies in Kiev, you have all of these Ukrainian intellectuals who are going to Moscow, spreading literacy. And then of course later you've got Peter the Great. He's bringing all these Dutchmen back from the Netherlands into Russia, also teaching them math, engineering, science, literacy, all this other stuff. So you have a more effective state structure You know, you have more like legibility, I guess, where the state's able to see things more clearly, it's able to organize things better, plan things better, see the future, understand its situation, rather than just kind of going off oral reports. So Russia, you know, definitely not up to the level that the Protestant states to the west, which were highly literate. I think England had a literacy rate of like 60% by this point. You know, so nowhere near that, but certainly more advanced than it had been, and definitely more advanced than what these kind of Turkic-speaking tribes had. So the Russians would go, they'd build forts on various rivers, fords to block the Turkic nomads from migrating, or to force them to migrate only under certain conditions. You know, they would kept on extending this great wooden wall, which had been built in various stages, going all the way back to the 11th century, the 1000s. You know, again, to block these Turkic-speaking steppe nomads out from raiding their lands. So over the course of the 1700s, the nomads get less and less powerful. Whereas at the Battle of Poltava, you have the Kalmyks, which is this group of Mongols who had migrated more than 100 years before into kind of southern Russia. You know, had considered themselves virtually independent. They were gradually reduced into servants and, you know, subjectude. So the Russian government becomes much more powerful over the course of the 18th century. Now, with the Ukrainians, it's not all sticks with, you know, garrisons and armies and whatnot. There is definitely a lot of buy-in from the Ukrainian elites. Catherine the Great, for instance, even though she started off as a fairly liberal ruler, towards the end of her reign, she became far more reactionary. She actually institutes in a third period of serfdom, where more and more people keep on getting enserfed. That extends to Ukraine as well. And in Ukraine, that actually binded the kind of Cossack and Ukrainian elites much, much closer to the Russian government than they had been before. You know, now they have military commissions, they're required to serve in the military. They have all of their, you know, very extensive privileges backed up by the power of the Russian government. Whereas previously in the past, they hadn't been able to really enserf for. It was actually very, very difficult for them to get anything out of their, you know, supposed subjects. It wasn't. I know, you know, in a book I'm reading right now, actually, he describes it not as an egalitarian society, but as a military dictatorship tempered by mob rule. Since, you know, the Cossacks, if they didn't like their leader, they would just kill him, and they would find a new leader. So it wasn't so much a ideological concept of liberty as it was just a very poor, you know, group of bands that survived heavily off plunder and selling their services as military soldiers. So the integration with the Russian government definitely changed that. All of a sudden, they become wealthy, powerful, intermarrying with all these different families, becoming, you know, spreading literacy. And gaining vast new estates, and, you know, getting, whereas their peasants used to work for themselves and had to be, you know, took a great deal of hassle to get them to do anything for the Cossack nobility. Now all of a sudden the Cossack nobility had all of these various estates. That being said, not all the Cossacks were totally reliable. The Russian government, for the, you know, those Zaporizhians, they go, and after some successful wars with the Turks, they go, or actually no, it was the Poles. They go and actually forcibly relocate a lot of these Cossacks further to the east, away from their kind of original homeland in the southern part of the Dnieper River. Some of them actually flee to the Ottoman Empire for about 80 years, but eventually they go and migrate back to Ukraine in the 1830s. So that's kind of the Zaporizhian Cossack story. You know, very important part of Ukraine, since they controlled quite a bit of central Ukraine for quite some time. You know, whether independently for brief periods completely, or, you know, virtually independently under the suzerainty of the Russian Empire. So towards the end of the 1700s, you have the Russian Empire kind of launches two more expansions. They fight another war with the Turks. And in that war with the Turks, they finally bring the Crimean Tatars under their control. The fighting is absolutely vicious. There had been Turkic peoples in kind of southwestern Ukraine, what's nowadays Odessa Oblast, and they just kind of disappear from history. I haven't been able to find anything on their, I'm sure there's stuff in Turkish. I just can't read Turkish. But, in the Russians stuff, it says, oh yeah, there's all these Turkic people, and then there's these massacres during the Russo-Turkish War, and then, there's no mentions of any Turkic peoples in that region afterwards. So as far as I can tell, Prince Potemkin, he's the guy, that Potemkin villages are named after. As far as I can tell, he basically killed the entire Turkic population of kind of southwestern Ukraine, or they all fled to the Ottoman Empire. Once I open this up for questions and comments, I know a couple of you guys are Turkish or Tatar. Maybe what happened to those guys. I'm only familiar with the Turkic migrations that happened in the 1800s and the 1900s. Not aware of anything that happened in the 1760s and 1770s. So very, very merciless struggle. At the same time, you have to the west, Poland, Lithuania, has been decaying for over 100 years. By the mid 18th century, they'd had, attempts at absolutist consolidation in the sense of what happened in France and what happened in Germany, and also what happened in Denmark, failed in Poland. The nobles actually triumphed over the king, and rather than come to some sort of mutualistic agreement like the nobles and the king had in England, of course, which took a very bloody series of wars in the middle of the 1600s, the Poles actually had this thing called a liberum veto, where even one single nobleman in their assembly, the same, could decide, hey, nope, whatever the king was proposing is just not going to get done. And they did this for everything. They wouldn't let the king even get like a personal guard. They wouldn't let him hire the Cossacks to be his own private army, because they were worried that if he did build his own private army, that he would turn into an absolute monarch, just like all these other absolute monarchs had done. And it was probably well-founded fears. From reading Robert Frost's book on the Northern Wars, that was exactly what the Polish king intended to do. He wanted to turn Poland into this autocratic state where he could defeat the great landholders and, kind of turn Poland, Lithuania into a kind of eastern version of France or a southern version of Denmark. Anyhow, he lost, though. The noblemen, they were virtually independent in a lot of ways. They had their own armies, would fight like vicious wars against each other. Lithuania would just like repeatedly raise armies and like invade Poland, on behalf of the noble families there. They had all sorts of weird stuff where they would like align with Jews or Germans or Cossacks to fight each other. And the Polish nobility really considered themselves like a separate species from their serfs. There was this whole ideology called Somationism, where rather than kind of understanding, hey, we're Slavs and have something in common with the peasants, they instead insisted that they were the pure descendants of the Sarmatians and had nothing in common with the peasants that they ruled, and they were like this master race that lorded over everyone. Of course, that made them a lot of enemies. Like literally everyone hated them. Just because they were so arrogant and so rich and everything. And as a result, they couldn't really build up the, both for that as well as their political structure, they couldn't build up kind of the mass armies that the Prussians were building to the west, that the Russians were building up to the east, or that the Ottomans had always had to the south. So by the kind of mid to late 1700s, there's actually a series of 3 divisions of Poland where the Prussians, the Austrians, and the Russians agreed to divide the country. Now the Russians go and they take over most of the rest of Ukraine in these partitions, as well as the entirety of Belarus. The Prussians take kind of a western part of Poland around Posen. And they also take what was called Royal Prussia, the German-speaking part of Poland, that was kind of autonomous for a while, although that's not quite the right word. And then the Austrians go. The Austrians actually they're ruled by a woman called Maria Theresa. And Maria Theresa, she's a very Catholic, pious woman, believes everything she does is right, regularly talks to Catholic priests, very, very religious, unlike the contemporary Prussian and Russian rulers. Catherine the Great was, notoriously promiscuous. I think she had like 12 known lovers in her life, which was very promiscuous by the time. I don't know about, modern day cities, but widely reviled in Austria. And she was also a convert too. She had adopted Orthodoxy, one of those, when in Moscow, do as the Russians do kind of thing. And then meanwhile, you had Frederick the Great, widely rumored to be a closet atheist, openly scorned Christianity, fairly openly known as a homosexual. The French actually, rather than sending women to go, I guess the French in the middle of the 1700s, rather than trying to, they'd go and they'd recruit like courtesans and stuff to seduce various foreign leaders to get them, divulge state secrets with pillow talk. They actually sent a gay guy to go and try to seduce Frederick the Great. I don't think it worked out, but, it was definitely well known that Frederick the Great was gay and not religious. Even though, amusingly, a lot of Protestants at the time, they're really upset that Catholicism had been making all of these gains through its leverage of educational institutions. So as the result, they were willing to look past any Protestant leader's failings if at least he could beat the Catholics. So Maria Theresa, of course, was not like that. She was a very pious woman. Was like, oh yeah, what am I doing dealing with these horrible, horrible people who want to divide Poland with me? Well, like we talked about in the first lecture, and briefly mentioned earlier in this one, the Hungarians had actually ruled, kind of the western part of Ukraine back in the 14th century. So Maria Theresa, she looked at this and, she was like, well, at least I can prevent it from getting in the hands of the ugly Russians and the Prussians. So she goes and she uses, and she's the Queen of Hungary at the time. She uses her claim as the Queen of Hungary, says, as the Queen of Hungary, the western part of Ukraine, Galicia, which also includes kind of Bukovina, as well as Transcarpathia, so kind of the western third of Ukraine, or maybe western quarter, would go and be part of Austria. So she goes and declares herself the Queen of Galicia and Lodomeria, which is, basically the Latin word for, Galicia and that whole kind of area. So Poland in those three partitions, it gets divided up. You have the Austrians that control the west, and the Russians control the rest of it. So Ukrainian history kind of splits again at this point, since it's divided between different countries. You have, there still are a lot of Poles living within Galicia, both assimilated Ukrainians or people who have, extensively intermarried with the Poles. A lot of Catholics there, both Uniate Catholics who were, still held to that kind of Eastern rite of Orthodoxy. The priests could marry. They, had everything done the Greek way, even though they answered to the Pope rather than to the Orthodox Patriarch. You had full-fledged Catholics who were, part of the Polish-speaking branches of the Catholic Church. And then you also had Orthodox people who, still answered to the, various Orthodox leaders. The Russians had integrated, once they took Kiev back at the end of the mid to late 1600s, they'd actually integrated the kind of Kievan ecclesiastical institutions into the Russian Orthodox Church. So a lot of that stuff had gone over to the Russians and would continue to be a long-lasting Russian influence even in the west of Ukraine. Regardless, kind of that western region of Ukraine, Galicia was extremely, extremely poor. I know my ancestors who came from there, they were from Transcarpathia, not really Galicia. They were considered wealthy just because they owned some goats and some pigs. It was definitely, and that was in the 1900s. So you can imagine how much poorer it was back in the 17 and 1800s. So a very, very poor region, but still it gave Austria a good strategic position in the sense that, now they had access through the Carpathian Mountains into the Great Steppe. So rather than, their soldiers having to potentially have to besiege mountain fortresses to invade Russia, or to cross into Poland. Now they had these paths that they could directly march into the Great Steppe much easier. They could set up fortresses, whatnot, and that would end up being very important later in World War One. At the same time, the kind of Polish nobility kept their political status under Austrian rule. Serfdom remained pretty common. They had corvée labor. Peasants would be, or they weren't even peasants, they were just serfs, would be forced to, work for the kind of Polish nobility under Austrian rule. And, just tons of class and ethnic hatreds. Ukrainians really did not like the Poles. And this has been, the conflict had been going back from the, Polish invasions of Galicia in the 14th century. So a lot of bad blood. And there was the Jewish population as well, which was also considerably unpopular since they worked very closely in hand with the Polish nobility, as far as like collecting rents, running liquor distilleries, that kind of thing. So all sorts of vicious ethnic hatreds. Further to the east, we talked about how the Ukrainian nobility was being integrated into, the Russian government, but they still had that kind of third extension of serfdom under Catherine the Great. Nonetheless, due to the strength and influence of the Orthodox Church, the region remained, somewhat reliably Russian for quite some time. Kind of like and I just want to kind of go off on another digression. We discussed in the first lecture, you have the fragmentation of Kiev and Rus and all these different substates back in, the 11th and 12th centuries. And so these states, they have very different histories. They have different trade routes and all that stuff. So the languages actually start to fragment. Even from, I believe, the 12th century, we have some Russian, or I should say Eastern Slavic writing from near Novgorod, which indicates that kind of the dialect spoken in Novgorod was very different from some of the stuff we have further south in Kiev, and definitely different from kind of the Church Slavonic, which was the literary language. Kind of like Latin had, turned into Vulgar Latin, which eventually evolved into the modern Latin languages like French, Romanian, Spanish, that kind of thing. Church Slavonic was like a literary language used for philosophy and governance and religion, poetry. It wasn't really spoken by the common people, though. You had all these different Slavic dialects. Now, these Slavic dialects, they kind of underwent, some of them kept on diversifying, like Ukrainian did, for instance, since it was under first Lithuanian and then eventually Polish and finally Austrian rule. And they had their own history going back to, the late 1000s. So, a very long period of divergence from the dialects that were spoken around Moscow. Moscow, Russian is actually noted for being a fairly homogeneous language, and one of the reasons for this is that, one, the Russian state was an autocratic state. You had these, limited number of educational institutions that would go and produce graduates, and these graduates would go out and govern the country. You had a huge number of soldiers who were forced to serve in the military, which also served to kind of level the dialects. People would intermarry with different families from different parts of Russia, and as a result, their kids would end up speaking kind of a dialect that was between the two. And then lastly, you had this mass die-off at the beginning of the 17th century. In the time of troubles from 1598 to 1614, I believe, about half the Russian population died, in a series of like Polish and Tatar invasions. And there's all sorts of like internal fighting with different dynasts struggling for who would be the Tsar of Russia. So for the survivors, it was a much smaller population and ended up a lot more leveled than even English did. England's worst die-off, I think, in the last, the big two die-offs in England in the last 1,000 years were the anarchy period of the 12th century, which killed off a huge fraction of the population, and then the English Civil Wars in the middle of the 17th century, which only killed 5% of the English population. As bad as that sounds, that's about comparable to World War II or the Napoleonic Wars for Europe as a whole. It's actually not that bad for pre-modern societies where people, there's very much a Malthusian limit. People will grow up to their, population carrying capacity. When you have, there's no birth control, very poor education for women, people end up having a bunch of kids and replenish losses of 5% fairly quickly. Far worse is to end up with issues like what Poland, Lithuania had, where the actual government structure collapses. You have the breakdown in trade, areas that suffer from famines or banditry can't have those issues dealt with, and as a result develop a much, or even the destruction of irrigation, which was particularly devastating in Middle Eastern societies that didn't get nearly as much rain as European societies. It would end up being a lot more devastating than any amount of dying. So basically, preserving law and order and kind of a unified government was a much bigger deal for population growth and population capacity than how many people died in this war or that war. Humanity is fairly robust, which is good. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. Where was I going with? Oh, yes, so the dialect leveling. So, you have like the dialect spoken around Moscow ends up being, the ancestor of what we call, modern day Russian, Great Russian, as it's called in the Russian censuses of the 1897. So as a result, now even within Great Russian, there are some dialects, like there was, up in the far north in the Arctic Circle, people very heavily intermarried with the Finno-Ugrian peoples there. They did all sorts of sea trade, sailed around the Arctic Sea or Arctic Ocean. So they had their own kind of dialects, but that stuff was still fairly minor. The three kind of big dialects were, the dialects descended from Galicia, Volhynia, and the Zaporizhian Cossacks, which is Little Russian or Ukrainian. It's modern Ukrainian, Little Russian, known in the 1897 census, the Russian Empire. And then you had Belarusian, which was very heavily Lithuanian influenced, kind of the remote swamp peoples that were largely only annexed by Russia during the partitions of Poland at the end of the 1700s. And then, Great Russian is everyone else. So with the end of so you have those kind of three main linguistic groups. Now, identity is kind of a complicated topic. The kind of north-central Ukraine, there's a city called Chernigov or Chernihiv, whatever you want to call it. It had actually been ruled by Russians for several extensive periods in the 15 and 1600s before it was finally taken for good in the mid-1600s by Russia. And it kind of like switched between Russian and Polish rule, in that 200-year period. Now in Chernigov and Chernihiv, the people there overwhelmingly consider themselves to be Ukrainian and not Russian, even though the region actually has a far more extensive history of being ruled by the Russians than it does, than the separatist regions of kind of eastern Ukraine as well as Crimea. And that's where, kind of the 19th century comes into play. Like that's when the dialectical differences had been there for a very long time. The ethnic differences had also been there for a very long time. But the concepts of kind of Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian identity, even though they had roots from their much earlier, processes and events, they were only, at least in relation to the current conflict, they were only really set in the 1800s. That's when you have, there's several Ukrainian writers who, ironically, are most successful, not in Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, but in St. Petersburg, the capital of the Russian Empire. One of them by the name of Taras Shevchenko, who eventually, he's a famous poet and writer, and it goes a long way to kind of consolidating coming up with, a standard Ukrainian language in a lot of ways. There were a lot of other people with him. There were kind of like these Ukrainian cultural brotherhoods, which were outlawed, closely linked to ideas of liberal nationalism. They glorified the Cossacks. A lot of them were kind of pan-Slavists in a way. Not necessarily, they were against the Romanovs. They didn't like the autocratic government, valued freedom, that kind of stuff. So a lot of those guys were outlawed during, kind of a very repressive period of Russian history from the 1790s through the, 1820s, 1830s. But they did leave their influence, cultural. They could speak the language of a lot of these rural peoples, and especially since they're serfs, they didn't have that much else to do for culture other than, listening to poets. I guess like rap music would be kind of the best equivalent today for what poetry was in the beginning of the 19th century. Having that kind of rhyme and meter and whatnot makes it easier for the singers or poets to remember. And you can go and get like a lot of feeling and meaning behind those words and rhymes and all that stuff. Yeah, I think rap music would probably be the best equivalent for our time. So you have all these guys, they're kind of, and again, the Ukrainians, they don't really have like a national identity at this point, but there is that kind of culture that's starting to develop. And at the same time in Russia, you have the same thing. You have all these peasants who are being exposed to, Russian literature, which again has more of a liberal romantic bent than, it would later. There's this whole like genre of literature called the superfluous man. I guess there were just so few literate people in Russia at the time that you could be like just write anything, and if you published it far enough and it was like a decent enough story, you could influence like everyone important in the country. Um, so, very much an era where intellectuals could punch well above their weight, as opposed to today where there's just so many, and no one knows who like 99% of them are. Back then, it was just a handful of few who could write in their free time or even write at all. And had the connections to spread their writings broadly across society. And of course, this would increase as literacy improves in the 19th century. So, we mentioned the Crimean Tatars had been defeated. The kind of flat steplands had been opened up for settlement. Now, the steplands, they hadn't been really agriculturally exploited in a very, very long time, so they had very, very good soils. They were even good soils before, even beyond like the if they hadn't been intensely exploited. It's called the Chernozem, and it's translates literally as black earth. They have it in parts of Manchuria as well as Pennsylvania. Just very, very rich soil that you can get very, very good yields from. So there's this huge migration wave from these areas, which were safe relatively from the kind of steppe nomad raiders, and they're all mass migrating down south into this steppeland to go, and it opened up for farming. So it includes a lot of Russians, people who were lived in kind of that golden ring of cities, surrounding Moscow for a couple hundred kilometers. They go and mass migrate. You have Germans, Jews, Poles, Greeks, Armenians, all sorts, Setians. They go and they kind of mass migrate there in the, kind of early to mid 1800s. There have been some before, but they really start pouring. I think there's like 500,000 end up migrating during like a 20-year period. So they set up all sorts of agricultural colonies, and of course, since it's virgin land, their population explodes. Russia's population at the time of the Napoleonic Wars, they were actually outnumbered by the French. There were only like 38 or 34 million people in Russia. And that includes like Ukrainians and Poles and, ethnic Russians, Mordvins, Tatars, whatnot. Meanwhile, there were 38 million people in France, or, I guess I should say the French Empire, which included like Catalonia and the Low Countries and, the west bank of the Rhine. So the Russian population actually explodes, and it's like 120 million, I think, by the time of World War I. So just very, very rapid population growth, and Ukraine is especially explosive, not just from immigration, but natural increase as well. Due to the kind of structure of the Russian Empire, the urban areas, Kiev, Odessa, Kharkiv, all of those cities end up having substantial Russian minorities, if not majorities. The Ukrainians remain an agricultural population. Part of this is due to cultural assimilation. You had a lot of people who were ethnically Ukrainians, came from like an ethnic Ukrainian background, who nonetheless end up speaking Russian just because they have to when they're living in these urban areas. At the same time, you do have this kind of mass migration of these more educated Great Russians from kind of the core of Russia as they move into new industrial centers. They go to areas that have, there's cities like Odessa, which are by rivers, so it's very easy to, have kind of shipping out in the Black Sea, sail out the Straits of the Bosphorus, then can access the world markets. So as a result, the region, both from its kind of closeness to the Black Sea and the waterways of the world, as well as its rich agricultural soil, becomes a fairly wealthy agricultural region. And Galicia has similar issues, except the issue is Galicia's population is growing so fast that it actually like outgrows its growth and wealth. So the region actually gets like more and more immiserated as time goes on, which makes people in Galicia like hate each other more and more. And that kind of Galicia, and that's the western part of Ukraine controlled by Austria, was just kind of a time bomb waiting to go off, and had been, even in the kind of partitions of Poland, there had been, in kind of that chaos, there had been massacres of like Armenians and Greeks and whatnot. But 1848, like it really exploded. The Polish nobility, they had, of course, aligned with Napoleon during Napoleon's invasions of, during the Napoleonic Wars. So, they're heavily influenced by liberal ideas, had a lot of sympathy with France, very into French kind of liberal intellectuals. A couple of them actually went and fought for us in our War of Independence. So they go and, they have all this, start all this fighting, agitating. They see that the King of Austria is weak, or I guess he's the Emperor of Austria by that point. So they go and they really want to win autonomy for the whole of Galicia, both West Galicia, which is nowadays in Poland, as well as East Galicia, which is nowadays in Ukraine. So they go and now the Austrians, they're pretty smart. They go and they see that there's all these ethnic divides in Galicia, so they align with the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians, they go and their entire leadership is actually Uniate Catholic priests. So the Uniate Catholic priests, of course, they're very conservative. They're really like the emperor in Vienna. And, as a result, they go and they petition the Austrians that they divide Galicia between a, Ukrainian divided, it was like 70% Ukrainian East Galicia, and then the Poles have their own West Galicia. And then, the Ukrainians would go and get representation and benefits and whatnot. So that didn't really happen. The Austrians kind of put it off because they didn't want to upset the, powerful Polish noblemen. But there was a bunch of like massacres where like, the Ukrainian peasants would rise up and murder their Polish rulers. And I think they killed a bunch of Jews too. So definitely a very vicious struggle, a lot more vicious than the fighting in a lot of other, parts of Austria. Although Hungary, I think, had some areas where like towns were leveled, by like vengeful Russian soldiers. Because the Hungarians kind of rose up and had their own liberal nationalist uprising in 1848 as well. You had like the Germans and the Czechs and Czechia came together to like propose for liberalism, but ultimately the forces of reaction were too strong. Emperor of Austria restored order, but the balance of power kind of did change, and the Ukrainians were given more of a role in Austria in the future. Now, Austria was a wealthier country than Russia. It was more developed. Had the Germans, the Czechs, all this stuff in like Vienna, Prague, whatnot. So the as a result, Austria had access to kind of superior forms of financial institutions as well. So one of the benefits that the Galicians have is they start to have these agricultural co-ops and credit unions that start to form. So, in the cooperatives, if you're an ordinary farmer, right, you have, you just kind of grow your crops, you bring it to a market, and you hope you can get a good price for it. And, if you don't, you lose a bunch of money. Eventually your farm and you starve to death or end up being like a poor proletarian, in a town or whatnot. But on the other hand, if, maybe you got lucky, you could go and sell your crops for a very good price, make more money, pay off your debts. That kind of thing. So it was pretty chancy. People were never too far away from ending up poor. And the idea of these co-ops is they would have these organizations that can negotiate prices for their members. So, rather than it being kind of a, rags or riches type of thing for the farmers in Galicia, you had, these, all of a sudden people would get, they didn't have as much of a chance to get rich, but they weren't going to end up poor either. So you had all these guys, you had this explosive growth of these co-ops everywhere. Eventually, they worked with credit unions. People would set up kind of small savings accounts. Earn money from their interest. They could get loans at lower interest rates to buy agricultural equipment or to buy seeds. Just tons and tons of stuff. So, the kind of result of this wasn't just to make, people wealthier. It wasn't just to, make things easier for these, Ukrainian farmers in Western Ukraine. It also created a new class, whereas previously you just had this religious class, going back hundreds and hundreds of years, of either the Orthodox priests or the Uniate Catholic priests, or, even just the normal, regular Catholic priests. Now you had these financial institutions. You had, guys who would investigate like financial fraud, so that you couldn't have hucksters going around and stealing, defrauding peasants of their hard-earned money. People could be building up credit, building up interest. They could get loans. And you had. It really built social trust. People knew they could store their money in a place where it wouldn't get stolen. There wasn't a risk of it, as much of it, I guess, having their money getting risked burned down if there was like arsons or, just an accident. And it spread literacy too. You had to be literate to work in a bank. You had to learn math. And these credit unions kind of cooperate. These credit unions and cooperatives, they cooperated with each other across a broad span of territory. Some of them reached into Canada, into Austria itself. They worked with Ukrainian politicians in the Austrian Diet. So they got to know how to run a state, how to run financial institutions, how to kind of use collective bargaining to get good prices for goods. You have this you have modernity, basically, that's developing under Austrian auspices in Western Ukraine, and this development of this, new, governing class in Ukraine that's secular and outside the church. And these people would be hugely influential in, what later became the Western Ukrainian People's Republic, which was the Ukrainian separatist, state that split off from Austria-Hungary at the collapse of Austria-Hungary during the First World War. Meanwhile, Russia did have cooperatives and credit unions that they took off a lot later, though. There was a lot of legislation that restricted them. The Russian government was always very, very paranoid about the development of a civil society, as well as certain types of financial institutions, since they knew that they could finance separatism. They knew that they could develop people who are outside the government authority, and outside of their kind of bureaucratic, absolutist political structure. That being said, though, under Nicholas II, who's far more of a modernizer than people give him credit for, a lot of that stuff did become legalized, and it immediately took off, not just in the Ukrainian rural areas of Russian-controlled Ukraine, but also in the Russian-speaking cities of Ukraine as well. Those people, unfortunately, were almost entirely exterminated during the, kind of Bolshevik Revolution. I mean, they were bourgeoisie, kind of that hated administrative class. But it also spread to the Kuban region, which is kind of modern-day southwestern Russia. Kind of like area near Krasnodar, Rostov-na-Donu, that kind of area, just to the south of there. So very, very, kind of delayed by 30 or 40 years from what the Austrians were doing. And as a result, you had, the financial institutions, the social networks, the political structure of Ukraine and the Russian-controlled parts were a lot less developed than the financial institutions, civil society, all of that in the Austrian-controlled part of Ukraine, even if the ethnic conflict wasn't as bad. So at the same time in Ukraine, you also had, we mentioned, about 20% of the immigrants to Ukraine during the period were non-Slavic. You had, Greeks, Armenians, you had French people. There's actually a sizable Spanish community in Odessa at one point. There's actually a street named after one of the Spanish guys who was very famous there. He had fought in the kind of a guy like he was a fanatical Christian, and he really wanted to fight the Muslim Turks, as a crusader. So he ended up going and joining the Russian military and fighting in the Russo-Turkish War, and ended up working with Prince Potemkin to kind of conquer the Black Sea coast of Ukraine in the 1760s and 1770s. I can't think of what that street's name is, but yeah, there's like a statue of him and everything there. So kind of going forward, Odessa in particular was, incredibly diverse, massive port city, start to have kind of like the oil industry, that's there. I think there were a couple other, in the Austrian part of Ukraine, Galicia, there was a sizable oil industry that started developing in the early 1900s. It was actually largely German run. You had all these German immigrants from both the German Empire as well as the German speaking parts of Austria who moved in there and, developed it. Some of them, interesting, ended up, after that kind of chaotic period, uh, with the Russian Civil War and the Polish takeover, World War I, all of that, they actually ended up in Los Angeles, where they worked on, exploiting the oil fields in Long Beach and Inglewood. So they pop up in the history of Los Angeles as well. The Germans of Ukraine, even though they actually had a fairly short stay there. Another one of the immigration, though, of foreigners had largely ceased after the mid 1800s. The Russians were kind of worried about the growing diversity of the area, understandably, since they only really trusted Orthodox Christians. Protestants, Muslims, especially Catholics, other groups were, feared as subversives, and with good reason, given that the Poles were constantly trying to overthrow the government, with like bank robberies and insurgencies and occasional uprisings. Um, it wasn't until kind of the later that other groups, whether the proletariat, the very poor workers of the cities, the Jewish communities that were moving from towns into the cities, um, various unassimilated Slavic peoples like Poles who had settled in the middle of the country but hadn't forgotten their hatred of the Russian Empire. Those people started causing a lot of problems later on in the 1800s. Um, and, completely understandably so. They didn't have any stake in the Russian Empire. Russian Empire had treated a lot of them horribly. They were denied representation. A lot of them were very, very poor, didn't have that much to lose. So you had all sorts of, very much a coalition of the fringes. You had like these German noblemen, noble women. You had like part Chuvash, like part German, part Jewish people, like Lenin, for instance, who was like a one-man coalition of the fringes. I don't think he had like any Russian ancestry. He was like 100% non-Russian, or he might have had a Russian grandparent. I can't remember. So all sorts of groups, a lot of Caucasians too, Georgians like Joseph Stalin, a lot of Armenians like Anastas Mikoyan, all sorts of groups were very interested in the violent overthrow of the Russian Empire. They had some connections with foreign intelligence, the British in particular, also the Japanese during the 1904-1905 war. So Ukraine's industrializing, things are improving everywhere outside of Galicia, at least. And then 1905, or the Great War with Japan happens. So, there's all these foreign intrigues as Russia's expanding the east. They fight a war with Japan. I mean, that's another complicated issue. Anyhow, there's all these, the Russian Empire is not particularly stable. It's costing a lot of money. And a lot of people see their chance to act. So, there's all this unrest that goes on. You have in the Baltic states, you have the Estonians, the Latvians as they're fighting like the German noblemen. You have, kind of in the western part of Russian controlled Ukraine, a place called Volhynia. You have these like Jewish terrorists that are constantly assassinating government officials. So as a result, you have like the Orthodox Christians form these groups called the Black Hundreds. It sounds like a really menacing name, but kind of like translated, you know, hundreds, Sotnya is kind of like 100. Just kind of means like a group, basically, like a mid-sized group of people. And then black, even though it has kind of like dark connotations in English, for them it would have meant like the common people or like the ordinary people. So, black hundreds, even though it sounds very menacing in English, it basically means like the common man or the groups of the common people. Um, and then there are other groups that, so, they consider themselves kind of like ordinary people who are going out and saving their, fatherland and Tsar and Orthodox faith from all these like atheists and Catholics and Jews and Caucasians and Turks and, everyone who wasn't Russian and Christian. Um, so, they were very active there, had all sorts of like fights with these left wing organizations. Thousands of people, tens of thousands actually got killed. Whether it was like massacres or hangings or assassinations, bombings. The Caucasus in particular was just, the Caucasus had never really been totally pacified. The region, that's kind of the Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, as well as the Russian regions south, just north of there. They had always been chaotic. Long history of kind of mountain warlordism, where a guy would hold up in a mountain with a couple dozen retainers and raid people. It's just all sorts of chaos. And the result, though, was that Ukraine, at least the Russian-controlled part, actually became very, very pro-Russian, or pro-Tsarist during that period. A lot of the landholders, the businessmen, kind of that bourgeoisie that the communists love to hate. They saw with that kind of unrest that their fates were tied in with the success of the Russian state. Now, they wanted representation too. They supported democracy, which they had a lot of reasons to believe they would benefit from. The Tsar, however, did not want them to be involved in politics. A lot of them are considered kind of like rude rabble. And, the one thing that those Black Hundreds types hated more than anything, besides the foreigners or whatever, were the insufferable noblemen who governed the Russian Empire. They felt they were a bunch of foreigners, which, in a lot of cases was actually true. Tons of them were of Tatar. The Tatars were the Turkic-speaking peoples that had ruled the steppes for so long, or Germans. So those were widely resented and had been widely resented for quite some time. And I think some of them actually like assassinated the noblemen that they hated so much. I guess like a good modern equivalent would be like the Trump Republicans versus the kind of mainstream like old Republicans. Um, that kind of conflict where you have these like very wealthy businessmen or whatnot, with all these foreign connections who look down upon this mass of rural Republican people that they don't have anything in common with, and only want as a vote bank. Not a perfect comparison, of course, but that's kind of like the feeling between those groups back then, except way more extreme. So a lot of Ukrainians supported those groups. You had like emigration from Ukraine in particular. A lot of the Jews left at the time. And at the same time, too, you also had some of the foreign groups, they saw this pressure and they chose kind of class loyalties or ethnic loyalties and decided to align with these, Slavic, people in the cities. So that's how you get like a lot of these Ukrainian Germans end up being, very intensely kind of pro-Russian and right-wing during that period. They'd seen all this chaos and anarchy and didn't want it to happen again. And they really wanted the government to stay up and Russia to win. So anyhow, the Russians, they start off with representative government. The Tsar in 1908, he goes and kind of backstabs everyone and has his own like auto coup where he kind of ends that some of the democratic reforms that he granted in 1905, 1906, which of course alienates everyone. So there's like stuff like the Steplands reforms, all this agricultural stuff that's supposed to make things nicer for the peasants and like agricultural people. There are all sorts of issues that, because they liberated the serfs back in the mid 1800s. It wasn't a great, like, freedom program. A lot of these people ended up still very, very poor. And they weren't really, some of them ended up being settled in areas of the Russian South and Ukraine, where they ended up becoming very wealthy and very successful. It's not a coincidence. Those were the areas where the kind of pro-democratic, pro-government forces, were strongest in the Civil War, as well as Siberia. Whereas the kind of more impoverished areas where land reform wasn't done, those areas tend to be much more like pro-Bolshevik, pro-socialist during the Civil War. So agricultural policy mattered a great deal. Not so much as far as like the government structures and like ideology and stuff, but definitely as far as like which groups would sympathize with which political factions. So Russia goes, the World War I starts, and Austria and Russia have to deal with kind of like an awkward situation. So you have all these like German and Jewish immigrants on the Russian side of the border in Ukraine that are widely believed to be sympathetic to the Austro-Hungarians and the Germans, since Germany is known for being kind of like a philo-Semitic state. Um, you have like the guy who's running Germany's like chemical warfare program is Jewish, like one of the finance guys is Jewish. So the Jews were kind of seen, like even in France actually, as being on like Germany's side. And of course the Jews were very much against, in a large part, I should say, not exclusively, because there were kind of pro-imperial Jews as well. So a lot of them are kind of stereotyped as being pro-Germany or pro-Austria-Hungary. Meanwhile, across the border in Austria, you have all of these, Ukrainian-speaking, like Eastern Slavic Orthodox people in Galicia and Transcarpathia and Bukovina, and they go and they're seen as being pro-Russian, because of course they're Orthodox and they're Slavic. So there's all this ethnic cleansing that gets forgot about in 1914, 1915, 1916. All of these Germans get forcibly relocated to the Volga, where a bunch of them starved to death by the Russians. There's like anti-German riots where like Germans are murdered and whatnot. Jews get targeted for the same stuff by the Russians. And then meanwhile, on the other side, the Austrian government forcibly relocates a lot of the kind of Eastern Slavic peoples of Galicia to a concentration camp called Theresienstadt, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing. I can't speak German. Where of course a bunch of them die too. So it's all very tragic. Tons of people die. There's all this vicious fighting, and Galicia kind of collapses into internecine ethnic feuding as soon as all of these armies leave. You have Poles fighting Ukrainians, Ukrainians fighting Poles. The Jews have their own combat groups, but kind of like change alliances depending on whoever's in power. So very, very vicious stuff. Anyhow, in the end, everyone collapses, and or I should say Russia collapses. The Germans send Lenin into Finland. He goes to Petrograd, St. Petersburg, Leningrad, whatever you want to call it. And, Russia collapses into the Bolshevik, or first they have in February 1917, the Russian Revolution, where the Tsar is overthrown by a cabal of liberal and socialist politicians. They start having stuff like soldiers' democracy. They still do have some like successful combat operations, but the military is disintegrating. You're starting to see like much more radical revolutionary forces on the street. And, just all sorts of craziness happening. Ukraine is no exception. You have, these left-wing socialist and communist groups that have been active actually in Kiev for quite some time, as well as Kharkov or Kharkiv. And they go, and are very active in setting up kind of a communist Ukraine, or Soviet Ukraine. Soviet literally just means like council, by the way. It's not like a scary, untranslatable foreign word. I think they just do it to make the Soviet Union sound like a much more radical, I guess it was pretty radical, but more foreign and exotic force than it actually was. When really they just kind of wanted organizational councils to run everything per their specific totalitarian ideology. Where was I going with this? So, 1917, February, Russian Revolution, liberals and socialists, I should say like democratic socialists, take over. All sorts of chaos, soldiers' democracy. They're kind of weak. They have the stuff. They're worried about there being like a right-wing Napoleon figure taking over. So they kind of like limit the strength of those forces and kind of ignore that the communists, the Bolsheviks, which literally means like the majoritarians, are building up their strength and openly plotting to overthrow the government. So the Bolsheviks go, they overthrow the government in Petrograd, everything's in chaos, they take Moscow by storm. Um, and they sign this treaty with Germany and Austria-Hungary, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. So the Baltic, Belarus, and Ukraine were all going to end up, within that kind of German and Austro-Hungarian sphere. So the Ukrainians, they go and they get set up under the Ukrainian state or the Ukrainian hetmanate. The hetmanate, that's kind of a reference to that, like we talked about in lecture 2, Bohdan Khmelnytsky. His government was called the hetmanate. His rank was the hetman. That's kind of like the ruler of the Cossacks. That's their term, the hetman. And, or Getman, depending on, how you want to pronounce it, but I pronounce it hetman. So he goes and he has this like German puppet regime where he doesn't really have much authority, but the main thing for the Germans is that the Germans can withdraw most of their soldiers to go to the west to take place in the spring offensive and hopefully knock out the Western allies from the war before the Americans show up. It doesn't work, of course, but he goes, he's constantly like sending them grain. He forms this like oligarchic cabal of like the nobility men and big business and these massive agricultural groups as like the basis for his regime. Of course, he has very little popular support. He's a total puppet, and the socialists under a guy called Semyon Petliura are actually a lot more popular with the Ukrainians in the rural areas. So after Germany collapses, Petliura and his men, they go and they take over Kiev and declare the Ukrainian People's Republic. Now, which is kind of like a democratic socialist state. It's not communist. They're definitely like a lot more free, we're believers in democracy, that kind of stuff, even if they didn't really practice it that well. They were at least, democratic in theory. So they go and they kind of control the center of Ukraine. And, there's this very complicated series of intrigues because you have the West Ukrainian People's Republic that's forming in kind of Galicia and Transcarpathia, which actually has a lot of people who are experienced in governing, unlike the Ukrainian People's Republic based out of, Kiev and I don't think they controlled Kharkiv. I think it was mostly controlled by the communists. So you have kind of like all these different factions that are feuding over Ukraine. You have kind of where the Zaporizhian Cossacks were on the lower part of the Dnieper River. They go and they, there's this group around this guy called Nestor Makhno, who goes and forms this anarchist group, which of course is like viciously murderous. They, hate Germans more than anything in the world and, murder them in horrible ways. Then you have like the whites who want to reunify Ukraine, actually go and overrun a lot of Ukraine at, 2 different points, I think. One of the guys, his name was Andrei Skro. He led this group called the White Wolves. Very fearsome guy, very brutal too. The Ukrainians played a role in pretty much every single side. There are Ukrainian Bolsheviks, there are Ukrainian socialists, there are Ukrainian reactionaries, there are Ukrainian whites too. The guy in my avatar, Pyotr Wrangel, who was a white general, who fought for kind of the restoration of the Russian provisional government under the white movement. His wife was, his wife's parents were Ukrainian noblemen, or Ukrainian noblemen and Ukrainian noblewoman. So it was a lot more integrated back then. And the ethnic divides weren't as clear cut as, they would later be. So anyhow, Petliura's regime, he basically screws up on everything. One thing he does is ally with the Poles against the Western Ukrainian People's Republic. His idea is that the Western Ukrainian People's Republic, is disposable, even though they have kind of the best government structure and everything. His main enemy is the non-socialists, in the white movement. And that's also the main enemy of the Poles, too. The Poles definitely have kind of a large socialist element. They're very fearful of a restored Russia, either in reactionary or liberal forms, that would want the restoration of the empire and, of course, include Poland. And the Poles themselves, they wanted to conquer all of Galicia, which they succeeded in, since they viewed it as the rightful territory in Polish land, even though Poles were only like 30% of the population. So, a lot of bitter fighting, all sorts of massacres. I mean, there's no good guys or bad guys in the war. I'm most sympathetic with the whites because, they would have restored the provisional government and set up Ukraine as like an autonomous region, sort of like what some of the, republics like Udmurtia or Tatarstan have in Russia today. And I think that would have been much, much better than what actually happened with communism and fascism and whatnot. But hard to say. So in the end, Ukraine is divided. You have Transcarpathia, which is where my ancestors are from. That part, it doesn't want to be part of Romania, Hungary, or definitely not Poland, because of course the Poles were widely hated. So they go and they end up being part of Czechoslovakia and are granted kind of like they're made an autonomous region. Galicia and parts of Volhynia and western Ukraine are part of Poland. Bukovina is made part of Romania, and the rest of Ukraine ends up as part of the Soviet Union. Now, during all the chaos of like World War I and the Revolution and Russian Civil War, there were a lot of population movements. One of those population movements is where people from western Ukraine end up in east of Ukraine in the modern day Donbass region, in Donetsk and Lugansk in the far east. Now, those people were, they called themselves, the Russophiles of, Galicia, who were under Austrian rule. They didn't like Austria, and they really hated Poles. They were usually Orthodox Christians, and they wanted to be part of Russia rather than Poland or, Austria. So a lot of those people ended up in, kind of the Don Basin, or the Nemets Basin, aka the Donbass, which is where a lot of the heavy industry of the Russian Empire was located. So there's always been a very strong, even for people who are ethnically Ukrainian, have ethnic Ukrainian names, ethnic Ukrainian background, have their roots in the far west, a lot of the people in the east of Ukraine, they have their ancestors from those people from the west of Ukraine that liked Russia. So you have this kind of thing going back father to son of, people who just liked Russia for whatever reason, and of course they still do, even to this day. And, a lot of them actually fought for it. So you'll see people with last names that end with like Enko, which is a traditional Ukrainian name ending that will, nonetheless be leading these separatist formations and, administering the government and whatnot. And sometimes we'll even have like ludicrously thick like Ukrainian accents, and people are like, why do you even want to be part of Russia when you're clearly Ukrainian and speak, you can barely speak Russian. Yeah, there's actually some kind of funny videos on YouTube you can find of that. So anyhow, the one of the kind of pro-Bolshevik, statelets that forms was the, I think it was, might have been, it wasn't called the Donetsk Lugansk People's Republic, but it was something like that. Might have been the Donbass People's Republic. But yeah, basically the east of Ukraine had its kind of own Soviet government, and it wanted to be part, it wanted it to be its own separate, kind of like Soviet republic. So rather than having there being a Soviet Ukraine, there would also be like a Soviet Donbass as well, just like there'd be Soviet Armenia, Soviet Kazakhstan, all of that. So, kind of a very confusing thing, but in the end, the Soviets, for various reasons, decided to put the whole region under, Soviet, Soviet Ukraine. It's kind of hard to get like an equivalent of, so they had this kind of nationalization program called Kornizatsiya, where the Ukrainian language was promoted in, I believe it was the first 20 years of Soviet Ukraine. So, all this stuff was, you have the spread of the Ukrainian language. There's mass teaching of Ukrainian language, Ukrainian literature in, the territories of Ukraine. Now, there were Ukrainians in other parts of the Russian Empire who were nonetheless left under the Russian Federative Socialist Republic, which eventually became today's Russian Federation. Particularly in the Kuban region, there were a lot of, I believe a majority in some parts of the Kuban were Ukrainian speakers rather than Russian speakers. that nonetheless, though, they were not put under the control of the Soviet Ukraine, so they ended up Russified. There was similar stuff that happened in the Far East. There were a lot of Ukrainian immigrants that settled in Siberia, as well as kind of all the way over to like Vladivostok, that area. I think some of those areas were like as much as a third Ukrainian. But since they weren't part of Soviet Ukraine, they eventually became Russified, and their identities were gradually forgotten. That wasn't always the case, though. Even in like the late 1800s and early 1900s, there were some pro-Ukrainian people who went, and traveled all the way to Siberia, and they would actually find like these 100% Ukrainian-speaking towns and greet them and be like, "Hello, fellow Ukrainians. We're glad you're here. We're definitely not Russians." So the Ukrainian identity, you definitely had, even though it was fuzzier than it would become later. There's definitely a concept of Ukrainian identity even before Soviet Ukraine that expanded quite deep into Russia. Soviet Ukraine, you have that. You have the communism is of course terrible. There were something like 8 million people died of a famine during the Russian Revolution and Civil War. That was mostly in the Volga. You had plenty of people die in Ukraine too. And the Soviets, they spread their collectivization policies, which were disastrous pretty much everywhere. Like half the Kazakh population in Kazakhstan died. You had, I believe, about 3 million Ukrainians starve in the early 1930s. They're just like murdering these prosperous farmers, and they would force everyone into these government-run collective farms that were poorly managed. People were lazy, they didn't have incentives to do well. A lot of the techniques they used were primitive, people were poorly educated, and so it was just disastrous all around. And once all these Ukrainians starved, there were ethnic Russians and others that would move into these prime agricultural regions to settle it later on, which of course is a major bone of contention. There are accusations that the Holodomor was a genocide and that it was Stalin's plan to deliberately murder all of the Ukrainians. I don't think it's really true in the sense that like it was similar to the Nazi genocide, where the Nazis considered people subhumans and targeted them for like physical extermination. This was more that like communism was just really bad and their political structure was horrible. And there's reports from some of these communist figures where they would receive like reports that, hey, we're taking the train ride and there's people starving everywhere, and then the guy would get shot for reporting it. It's just like a horrible political structure. They would be like, yeah, you can't say that people are starving because that would make communism look bad. And as a result, like people at the high ups wouldn't even realize that millions were dying. But that's not like I'm not trying to support or defend communism by this. I'm just saying it's horrible. But it was more that communism was just it was so bad that it had the same effects as deliberately murdering people, I should say. So communism's bad. Meanwhile, in Poland, it was better than Soviet Ukraine, but that's not saying much. The Poles deliberately, they had their own agricultural issues where people were concentrated, in the areas around like Warsaw, kind of Western Poland, and they had their own agricultural crisis. So one of the things they tried doing was they tried to get all of these impoverished Polish peasants to settle in Western Ukraine so that they could go and Polonize the region. A lot of Ukrainians absolutely hated this. For reasons going back hundreds of years. The Poles were given the best lands. They would beat up people who spoke Ukrainian. There were even punitive raids where the Polish military would march into Ukrainian villages and burn down the towns and stuff. And so as a result, you have the formation of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, which was this fanatical but very small group of Ukrainian nationalists in Western Ukraine. And they would go and assassinate various Soviet or figures who were occupying Ukraine, or they would assassinate Polish figures for doing horrible things to the Ukrainian people. And there's some writings from the Ukrainians who were living at the time that they were swearing that as soon as they got the chance, they would kill all of the Poles they could possibly find. It's definitely not like a healthy ethnic situation there by any means. Some of them, they hated the Poles so much that they reached out to, the new German government, the National Socialists in Berlin. They had their own kind of diaspora that had been working in, mostly in Vienna, but to a lesser extent in Berlin, that really wanted Germany to back Ukrainian separatism. And Germany actually did consider, I think in 1938, to declare its support for Ukrainian independence, but Hitler being a psychopath, he decided not to. His intentions, of course, were always for the extermination of the Slavic peoples. At the very least, a very, very cruel assimilation where most of them would be killed. So World War II begins. Poland collapses. Germany asserts its rights, going back to the divisions of Poland. I think Germans were about 5 to 10% of the Polish population at the time. So they asserted that gave them the right to interfere. There were some kind of mixed populations where they had German roots, but they spoke Polish. There's a lot of disputes about that. I don't really know that much about it though. But for the Soviets, Joseph Stalin, he announced that the Soviets were going to step in and liberate the oppressed people of Belarus and Ukraine, who, of course, were toiling under the capitalists and whatnot, and cited various ethnographic works. Stalin actually had a very long, pedigree as far as kind of studying of ethnicity and nationality. He was actually the communist nationality minister at one point, prior to becoming the leader of the Soviet Union, and wrote all these essays. And his definition of a nation was a group of people who lived in the same area, spoke the same language, and shared the same heritage. So he considered Ukrainians to be their own nation, as well as Belarusians. But I think that also kind of explains why the Ukrainians that were scattered across Siberia and the Far East were, not considered Ukrainians. They didn't share the same geography as the Ukrainians did in Ukraine. So he goes in, they introduce collectivization. A lot of those, we talked about those kind of agricultural cooperatives, the credit unions that did so much in, kind of building a civil society, making people wealthier. Those, even under Polish oppression, had survived. The Poles didn't want people to starve. They wanted the agricultural, they needed the agricultural exports from the region. So they didn't shut those down, and a lot of those that got devastated by the collapse of Austria-Hungary were restored. But the Soviets did shut them down. They had their own very different system of, collectivization, and finance that did not mesh well with the kind of capitalistic credit unions and cooperative type stuff. So, all those people, all their savings money just got wiped out in a day. It got confiscated. I think they shot a bunch of the bank managers or whatnot, just kind of the usual communist cruelty. So kind of that basis of Western Ukrainian civil society, which had done so much to develop the Ukrainian identity and government structures in the Western Ukrainian People's Republic, was snuffed out during the brief during the brief lull in relations between Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. So, the Ukrainians, of course, there's widespread hatred against Soviet rule. Actually, basically everyone hated the Soviets. They had never been a popular government. They only won 16% of the vote, I think, when they ran for their one fair election in 1917. So there were tons and tons of people with, and then of course all the murderousness and mismanagement and corruption and whatnot had made them, widely loathed across the USSR. So when the Nazis go, and it wasn't just the Nazis, it was, kind of the whole European axis with Italy and Romania, even the Finns join in. They go and they launch this giant invasion, and the Ukrainian nationalists are actually, immediately go and they declare their loyalty to Hitler. They think this is their great chance. The Germans are going to liberate them. Some of the cities in the West fondly remembered the ethnic German rule under the Austrians, who had been a sizable portion of the community of the city of Lviv in the west. Definitely a lot more than the hated Poles. So they actually went and set up like wreaths and stuff, and passed out. I think they gave like flowers to the soldiers, whatever. And for the initial invasion, some of the German troops were like, "Oh well, this is great. The people love us. We're liberators." And then of course, the Nazis had their psychopathic murder brigades that followed them. So they would round up, they rounded up all these poets and Ukrainian nationalists and arrest them or just shoot them in mass graves. Just horrible mistreatment. Because the German intention was to, destroy or brutally assimilate the, Slavic populations and, turn the survivors into Germans. So that alienated pretty much everyone, but not everyone, as it turns out. In spite of all of that, there were actually still plenty of Ukrainians who are willing to overlook the kind of Nazi cruelty and ended up aligning with them. They joined, basically these helper units. Can't pronounce the German word. It's like Hilflinger, but literally means helper. And they formed later on a couple of the SS units. One of them, SS Galicia, was a largely Ukrainian unit. The Cossacks, there were still Cossacks around. They, in the Soviet military as well as outside of the Soviet military. Some of them defected as a whole unit, actually. There were a couple cases where they would go and defect to the Germans once the Germans confronted their unit. The Nazis didn't really want to use them, although a couple of them were. I think there was a SS Cossack Corps that was formed and used in Yugoslavia. And there was all this debate, over whether or not they were Aryans. But the Cossacks, from the Cossack emigre writings, and these were the Kuban Cossacks, by the way, the ones from kind of the southwestern part of Russia, near Krasnodar and Novorossiysk. They went and they considered themselves their own totally separate ethnicity from both the Ukrainians and from the Russians, and they wanted to build have their own kind of fascist Cossack state. In the Kuban, as well as kind of in the steppe of the North Caucasus. Anyhow, they didn't get that far. The Germans didn't like them very much, and I don't think they were really used until 1943 or 1944. There were a lot, of course, overwhelmingly, most Ukrainians supported the Soviet Union, particularly once the cruelties of Nazi Germany had been, shown to everyone. They did all sorts of stuff. They'd lock people into churches and light them on fire and whatnot, just going out of their way to be cruel because, they're pretty nasty. In the far west, there were, insurgent movements. The Ukrainian insurgent army, they, fought the Germans along with the Poles. The Poles were also fighting the Germans, but they actually spent a lot of their time fighting each other. So in 1943 and 1944, these Ukrainians were actually given, the Germans knew they weren't going to be reliable allies, but they gave them weapons, and they used it to finish ethnically cleansing the Poles out of eastern Galicia. So, the region, pretty much all the Poles were booted out. I think 100,000 people or something were killed. Very, very vicious struggle. Sometimes when they didn't have weapons, they just fight each other with axes. The Indoeuropeans used to, all those 4,000 years ago. So very, very vicious conflict. But, the good news is that was when the Ukrainian and Polish conflict was finally wrapped up. Once the Soviets rolled in, they defeated the Nazis, reconquered the rest of Ukraine. They expelled what few Poles remained in eastern Galicia into the territories they had expelled the Germans from in Silesia, Pomerania, and South Prussia. As a result, Ukraine became homogeneously Ukrainian, except for a couple of, Belarus too. I think there's a couple of Polish villages in western Belarus, but other than that, Belarus is entirely Belarusian, and there's basically no Polish settlement anywhere in Ukraine. So Ukraine, the whole country is devastated. The Jewish population was largely wiped out in the Holocaust. Millions and millions of people were killed, both military and civilian. And it takes years and years to recover. I think at one point during the reconstruction of Kiev, like a lock broke, an area flooded, and a couple hundred people died. So it's just a very, massive gap between the number of men and number of women. So a lot of women were left unmarried. So a very, cruel period. Nonetheless, the post-war, you had kind of like the mass introduction of chemical fertilizers to a lot of the Soviet Union. So Ukraine, its population recovers actually fairly swiftly. Although, of course, it would have been much, much higher if it hadn't been for the ugliness of 1914 and 1945. So, the Ukrainians, they go and, it's very much a Russian-dominated Soviet Union after, Stalin had done his various purges of, kind of pro-ethnic intellectuals. The Ukrainians themselves end up playing a huge role in the kind of Union Communist Party, the Communist Party at the, kind of like USSR level wide party. A lot of the guys around like Khrushchev and Brezhnev and whatnot after the fall of Stalin and his like Caucasian clique, a lot of those guys were Ukrainian or had spent a lot of time in Ukraine. So Ukrainians, they're very influential in the state party, but you still, much like with Catherine the Great in the 1800s, with that integration of Ukrainians into the union-wide political structure, you also have with it Russification. Some of the Ukrainization programs were kind of reversed, and you have the increase in the amount of Russian speakers within a lot of the cities in Ukraine, Kharkov, Odessa, even though some of these cities ended up, like Odessa, I believe, or actually Odessa does, and still kind of does, have its own kind of like unique Russian accent. So Ukrainian was still very much a rural language, but then as urbanization continued, like even into the 1870s and 1880s, you have all of these rural people from Ukraine, from rural Ukraine who speak Ukrainian, they have Ukrainian identity, they kind of like the Cossack stuff, they're becoming literate, they're reading into their history and heritage. There's this Ukrainian cultural revival that actually happens starting in the late 1970s and goes into the 1980s. It's not really state-sponsored. A lot of it's still underground, but a lot of people kind of start remembering who they are. And there's this, as the Soviet Union kind of declines, there's a lot of people who want to go back and have independence. So finally, the Soviet Union, they have all these issues at the end. Gorbachev's reconstructing and openness, undermines the foundations of the Soviet state. It was never popular. It was never democratic. It was always built basically on totalitarian rule, and as that was reversed, the Union crumbled. The conflict, the first conflict, of course, that restarted was the Armenian-Azeri conflict. They had murderously hated each other for hundreds of years. And the Armenians and the Azeris were always doing like intrigues against each other within the Communist Party structures as well as within the South Caucasus. Thankfully, Russia and Ukraine didn't have that vicious of a conflict. There was extensive intermarriage between Russians and Ukrainians. Even today, if you go to Ukraine, a lot of people have Russian relatives, and if you go to Russia, a lot of people have Ukrainian relatives. So a lot of mixing, and the conflict isn't that vicious. They're still fairly good friends. So the Union falls apart, and as the Union falls apart, all of the Soviet republics, so Soviet Ukraine, Soviet Armenia, Soviet Azerbaijan, Soviet Turkmenistan, they all become independent. Now, a lot of the Russian figures, they, didn't want to recognize this at all. They considered Ukraine an integral part of Russia. And it's, there's stuff like the transfer of Crimea, which was something like 80% Russian speaking, over to Ukraine was more of like an administrative transfer. They transferred Crimea to Ukraine because, it's just convenient to it. It didn't make sense for Crimea to be part of the Soviet Russia. When it was much closer to Soviet Ukraine. They didn't imagine the Soviet Union would ever collapse, so it didn't really make a difference. It's like, I'm trying to think of what a good example would be, if we transferred, I don't know, South Texas to New Mexico, and then New Mexico later decided to, become independent or something. it wouldn't really matter that much to anyone in South Texas, then, but of course in the future, it would matter a lot because it would become an external border. At least that's how the Russians thought of it. Of course, the Ukrainians considered it an integral part of their state as well. And we're really did not like seeing it get taken by Russia in 2014. So the Soviet Union ends. There's all sorts of corruption. A lot of the kind of democratic financial institutions that we see that were developed in the West hadn't been developed in the Soviet Union. So there's this massive collapse in the 1990s. Ukraine's GDP falls by like 80%. Russia's collapses as well. Armenia and Azerbaijan fight some wars. There's a lot of like vicious stuff going on in Central Asia as well. Like Tajikistan has a civil war. And all of the states kind of resolve their problems differently. Russia, in the end, ends up with Yeltsin. You have the Chechens that go and they fight like two wars of independence against the Russians. The Tatar people in the Volga, they kind of struggle. They advocate for their independence, but don't really go too far since they'd be landlocked. And even in Russia, you still have kind of the remnants of that Ukrainian or Cossack identity in the Kuban region. They go and they promote like this, effort to rejoin Ukraine in the, kind of mid to late 1990s when Russia's at its nadir. Now Russia goes, and in 2000, they have their new president, Vladimir Putin, who's still in charge. And he's a lot more capable than Yeltsin. Russia's GDP quadruples within the first 10 years of his administration. He reverts, he does, it kind of brings a lot of law and order to the country, fixes up a lot of things, and that's something that does not happen in Ukraine. Ukraine still remains chaotic, remains very poor. And Ukraine actually has kind of a series of, revolutions, between more like urbanized and Eastern Russian speakers in the eastern part of the country versus the, more, conservative, more Catholic and more Western oriented people in the western part of the country. So finally and there's just constant like mass immigration too. There's tons of Ukrainians that end up moving to Germany, to Australia, to Russia, and to the United States and Canada as well. The country's depopulating fairly rapidly. Russia has been depopulating too, just not nearly to the same extent as Ukraine. At least a fifth and probably closer to 2/5 of the Ukrainian population has left since independence. So it's, very much a country that has a lot of very serious issues. So we finally get to, I'm going to try to wrap up the last decade in the next 5 minutes to get it under 2 hours. So 2013, the Ukrainian government, it's under this guy called Yanukovych. He's incredibly corrupt. He wants to balance the interests of his supporters who live in the mostly Russian-speaking East with the people in the mostly Ukrainian-speaking West who want to integrate more with the West and with Germany, get more into like IT industry. So he tries to triangulate between these two groups. The Westerners are outraged by this. So there's all these protests because he betrays his promise to integrate with the European Union and have all these more trade deals with the Europeans. And people are just, they're poor. They have nothing to lose. It's one of the poorest countries in Europe. So they eventually go out. They do this mass popular revolution with widespread popular support, and they overthrow the government of Ukraine in February of 2021 or February of 2014. One of the guys actually I have on here. He was a participant in it, and I really hope he'll share his experiences with us. So after that, a lot of the people in the East, most of them still support the unity of Ukraine, but in Crimea, which is mostly Russian-speaking, the Russian government goes and does not want their port of Sevastopol to be part of a now hostile foreign country. So the Russians send in a group of special forces operatives, and they go and they take over Crimea, presumably with broad support. What happens then is the Russians, they go and they kind of look at the situation. They see how successful the Crimean operation went, and there's a possibility to detach even more parts of Ukraine. So they reach out to kind of pro-Russian movements in what's called New Russia. That's the kind of most of the steppe region that had been settled after the conquest of the Crimean Hanat. Where many people are Russian speakers, Odessa, Kharkov or Kharkiv, Donetsk, Lugansk, all of those areas. And they reach out to protest groups to go. They want to rally people to overthrow the Ukrainian government and petition, make sure that their local, deputies or, representatives go and call for unification of their region with Russia. Outside of Donetsk and Lugansk, those demonstrations did not have widespread popular support. They were easily squashed by pro-Ukrainian forces. And this is not pro-Ukrainian government forces for the most part. This is, mobs of Ukrainian protesters, who go and defeat the mobs of the kind of pro-Russian separatists. Some of these are violent. There's like bombings, murders, a couple of people get burned alive, nasty stuff. The death toll is only a couple dozen. It's not like it's nearly as bad as what is what you would imagine reading the Russian news. Now in Donetsk, it's very different. The majority of the population in Donetsk and Lugansk did want to stay in Ukraine, but that was in large part because the rural population was still overwhelmingly pro-Ukrainian. The urban population, the strength between the pro-Russian forces and the pro-Ukrainian forces was a lot more balanced. A lot of people there had, it was very much a heavy industrial region. A lot of people there, they speak Russian, they do business in Russia. They're very closely integrated with the Russian businesses on the Russian side of the border. And there's kind of like this red patriotism where, people are very proud of their Soviet heritage and, their miners' union, working in the factory or the coal mine. So you have all these kind of like associations that can build up quite a big, crowd, to support independence, and all of those organizations kind of lined up behind the separatist forces. Even despite that, the Ukrainians did have enough kind of foresight to arrest a bunch of their leaders, and it would have, if it hadn't been for the Russian government, they would have squashed the separatist movement then. And, due to the polarization of attitudes with Russia, the, kind of Donetsk and Lugansk regions would be very solidly pro-Ukrainian today. That being said, though, there was, some of the Russian special forces and the regular forces who had been prepared to be infiltrated into the, Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine, were all called off for the most part, with one exception, a guy called Igor Strelkov, who was this Russian special forces guy. He put together a, kind of mix of a couple dozen, I believe about 80% of them are Ukrainian citizens, but he had kind of like a hardcore of, Russian veterans with him as well. So they reach out to the wife of one of the guys the Ukrainians arrested, and she sends a bus to pick them up. They drive across the border, take over some government buildings, and immediately start recruiting soldiers. So that's kind of the start of the Donbass War. It's this literally one rogue Russian special forces guy who refuses to listen to Moscow and just decides to invade Ukraine on his own. His goal was that he figured that the Kremlin was, super pathetic, and if he just started a war all on his own, that he would force them to intervene out of shame and embarrassment. He kind of succeeded. It just took a while. So he appeals to the people of the Donbass, which is, kind of that industrial region in eastern Ukraine, starts recruiting soldiers, leveraging his influence with all of these kind of pro-Russian groups, militias, MMA groups, miners' unions. They've got like the Orthodox Church groups, like Slavic neo-Nazis, which is, I know it's kind of an oxymoron. They brought like Ossetians and Abkhazians who had like fought with the Russians in their ethnic wars and felt they owed the Russians something. Just a lot of oddballs. Like the Libertarians sent guys, the National Bolsheviks sent guys, just the normal, like tanky Stalinist communists sent guys. So he's just recruiting basically anyone who's willing to fight will go and like fight for these guys. Um, there's also like he's not the only one too. There were other guys that rose up before him. Um, they would kind of like set up a crew, but then pretty quickly they realized they needed money. They started like looting people, made themselves unpopular. There are all these like mob assassinations in Lugansk, very chaotic situation. Um, but most kind of like the writers and the disciplined troops ended up with this Strelkov guy in a city called Slavyansk. So the Ukrainians, their military was kind of in chaos. Military was like there's a lot of like these legacy Soviet holdouts that were more like pro-Russian, and then of course they saw that they could get a better salary in the Russian military too if they're integrated, like some of the Ukrainian forces in Crimea had. So some of them actually went like defected over to the kind of separatist forces, believing that the separatist forces were in fact official government forces from the Russian Federation, rather than just like a rogue guy who had decided to invade Ukraine on his own. So they fight some battles. Everyone's thinking the Russians are invading, even though they're really not. The Russian government decided on the 18th of April, 2014, that it would actually recognize the new. It was just going to stick with only taking Crimea and not anything else. But after like a couple months of fighting, and you have all these Russian nationalists who were like crowdfunding armored personnel carriers and like funneling thousands of volunteers to invade Ukraine. The Russian government finally steps in, and they're like, well, we can't now that there's been enough like Russians that have gone, we can't really let them get defeated. So they intervene and kind of save the separatists at the last minute, in kind of the end of July and beginning of August 2014, where they go and they defeat the kind of more organized Ukrainian forces. So for the last couple of years, there's been skirmishes going on and off. The Ukrainians have massively built up their military. They've been purging it of Russian spies. And now they're in a considerably better position, at least relative to the two separatist regions, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, but still vastly inferior to the Russian Federation. A lot of Ukrainians, at least the ones I've spoke with, believe that Ukraine should join NATO, and that eventually the United States will have to step in to save Europe from Russian aggression. Whether that will happen or not, I have no idea. And that's kind of, I'm just here for the history. I know that went on a lot longer than expected. Hope you guys all learned something, but I am now going to open it up